A 74-year-old woman was driving alone before sunrise. Her hands rested quietly on the wheel. Behind her, a house filled with memories. Ahead, a place that had long felt forgotten. And then, on an empty stretch of road, she slowed down and stopped. For a moment, it felt like the journey had come to an end. But what happened next would quietly change the course of her life. What did she leave behind? And why did she leave without a word? And how did a quiet woman like her find the courage to choose a life alone in a worn-down house, far from everything she once knew? Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? A pale winter sun hung low over Cedar Ridge, Ohio, casting a thin, hesitant light across quiet rooftops and bare-limbed trees. The air felt still, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something it could not yet name. Margaret Maggie Lawson sat at her kitchen table, her fingers loosely wrapped around a ceramic mug that had long since gone cold. The kitchen was small, but carefully kept. Oak cabinets worn smooth with time, a narrow window above the sink, and a clock that ticked louder than it should have in the quiet. She had lived in this house for over 40 years. Every wall held a memory, though most days she moved past them without stopping. Maggie had grown smaller over the years. Not fragile, but contained. Her shoulders curved gently forward, shaped more by habit than weakness. Her hair, once a soft chestnut brown, had faded into a silvery gray she tied loosely at the nape of her neck. Her skin was pale, lined in fine, careful creases, but her eyes, steady, thoughtful blue, still held a quiet clarity. There was a presence about her, the kind built from decades of showing up, of enduring without complaint. That morning had begun like any other. She had risen before sunrise, made her coffee, and stood at the window watching the empty street. She had checked the thermostat, adjusted it slightly, and made a note to call someone about the heater if the noise returned that night. She still handled these things herself. Always had. Then came the sound of car doors. One. Then another. Then voices. Familiar, layered together in a way she had not heard in years. All three of them. Maggie didn't need to look to know. Her children rarely arrived at the same time. Their lives had stretched outward. Different cities, different obligations, different rhythms. Bringing them together like this required planning, intention. That was her first sign. The front door opened without knocking. Dennis stepped in first, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence filling the doorway before the cold air slipped in behind him. His hair, once dark, was beginning to gray at the temples, cut short in a way that suggested practicality over style. His jaw was set, his posture firm. He had spent years working as a regional operations manager in construction, a role that had shaped his thinking. Problems were meant to be solved, efficiently and decisively. It wasn't cruelty that guided him. It was certainty. Patricia followed, carrying a structured leather tote and a neatly organized folder. She moved with precision, her posture straight, her expression composed. Her dark blonde hair fell in a clean bob, framing a face that rarely revealed uncertainty. Working in healthcare administration had taught her to anticipate risk, to prepare for outcomes before they happened. To her, control was a form of care. though she had long since stopped questioning where the line between the two might be. Kevin came last, quieter, pausing just inside the doorway. He was taller than his siblings, but leaner, his dark hair slightly unkempt, his expression softer. A high school English teacher, he carried a different kind of presence, less certain, more observant. His eyes met Maggie's briefly, and something flickered there. Concern, yes, but also hesitation. "Morning, Mom," Dennis said, already moving toward the table. "Hi, Mom," Patricia added, placing her bag down. Kevin gave a small nod. "Hey, Mom." Maggie smiled gently. "You're all here?" she said. "That's rare." No one answered that directly. They took their seats around the table. Maggie noticed the way Patricia aligned her folder carefully, the way Dennis leaned forward slightly, already prepared to speak. Kevin sat back, hands loosely clasped, watching. There was a pause. Just long enough for the quiet to feel deliberate. Then Dennis cleared his throat. "Mom," he began, his tone measured. "We've been talking, and we think it's time we had a serious conversation." Maggie nodded once. "All right." Patricia opened the folder and slid a set of glossy brochures across the table. Bright images, sunlit rooms, smiling faces, manicured gardens. "It's called Maple Grove Assisted Living," she said. "We've done a lot of research. It's one of the best options nearby." Maggie glanced at the brochure, but didn't touch it. "They have full-time staff," Dennis continued. "Medical support, activities. It's safe." "You wouldn't have to worry about the house," Patricia added, "or being alone." "I'm not worried," Maggie said quietly. Kevin leaned forward slightly. "We just want to make sure you're okay, Mom." "I am okay," she replied. Dennis exhaled slowly. "The house is a lot to manage. And at your age, we have to think ahead. What happens if something goes wrong?" "I have neighbors," Maggie said, "and a phone, and a doctor who hasn't said anything about me needing to leave my home." Patricia's voice tightened slightly. "This isn't about now. It's about what could happen." Dennis tapped the brochure. "We've already spoken to them. There's an opening. We put your name down." The words settled heavily between them. "You put my name down," Maggie repeated. "It's just to hold the spot," Patricia said quickly. Maggie looked at them, one by one. "You've been planning this for a while." "Yes," Dennis said. "And none of you thought to ask me first." The silence that followed was different now. Kevin looked down. Dennis leaned back, his tone softening. "We're trying to take care of you." Maggie turned her gaze toward the window again. The yard needed work. The fence leaned slightly. The house wasn't perfect. She knew that. But it was hers. "What happens to the house?" she asked. Dennis and Patricia exchanged a glance. "The market is strong," Dennis said carefully. "Selling now would make sense." "It would help cover everything," Patricia added. "Your care, expenses, and it would ease things for all of us." All of us. Maggie heard it clearly. Not just concern, not just care. Something else woven quietly beneath it. She looked down at her hands, resting calmly on the table. Hands that had built meals, held children, fixed what needed fixing. She had spent a lifetime choosing. Quietly. Consistently. And now, her life was being rearranged, as if it were something that could be packed away. "I see," she said. The brochures remained on the table, bright and out of place in the muted light. And in that moment, Maggie understood something with a clarity that surprised even her. They were not asking. They had already decided. And for the first time in a very long time, something inside her did not step aside. The house felt different after they left. Not louder, not emptier, just aware of itself again. The brochures still sat on the table, their glossy edges catching the last of the afternoon light, as if they didn't quite belong there. Maggie didn't throw them away. She stacked them neatly instead, aligned the corners, moved them to the far edge of the table, where they could sit quietly without asking anything from her. She turned to the sink and began washing the cup she had used, even though it hardly needed cleaning. The water ran steady, filling the room with a soft, familiar sound. It had always been like this. When something felt unsettled, she found a small task and did it slowly. When the water stopped, the silence returned. This time, it stayed. Maggie rested her hands on the edge of the sink for a moment. The kitchen looked the same. The clock ticked. The chair across from her was empty. It had been empty for a long time. She dried her hands carefully and walked into the living room. Nothing had changed there either. The same couch, the same worn rug, the same photograph hanging slightly off-center on the wall. Daniel stood in that photograph, sleeves rolled up, a pencil tucked behind his ear, one hand resting on a half-built frame. He wasn't looking at the camera. He never did. He had always been more interested in the work than the moment. Maggie stepped closer. Daniel Lawson had been a man who carried quiet strength the way other people carried certainty. Tall, steady, with broad hands that seemed to understand materials better than words. His hair had turned gray early, but he never treated it like something worth noticing. His face had been shaped by sun and time, but his eyes, warm, attentive, remained unchanged. He didn't build things quickly. He built them to last. This house had been one of those things. Not all at once, not perfectly, but steadily, piece by piece, after long days working for other people. A wall added 1 year. A porch extended the next. A door adjusted until it closed just right. Maggie could still remember the sound of the hammer late in the evening, echoing softly through unfinished rooms. Those years had not felt hard. They had felt full. Dennis had grown up fast in this house. Even as a boy, he moved with purpose, as if time were always just a little too short. When Daniel had been sidelined by illness for a few weeks during Dennis's teenage years, it was Dennis who stepped forward without being asked, fixing what needed fixing, carrying more than anyone expected. It had shaped him into someone who believed problems should never be left waiting. Patricia had been different. Careful. Precise. She needed things to make sense, even as a child. Maggie could still picture her sitting at the table, organizing her school supplies into perfect lines. Over time, that need for order became something stronger, a belief that if everything was planned correctly, nothing would fall apart. Kevin had never rushed. He lingered, watched, listened. Where Dennis acted and Patricia arranged, Kevin noticed. He was the one who stayed in the room a little longer, who asked questions that didn't always have answers. Even now, Maggie could see it in the way he had looked at her earlier. Not quite agreeing, not quite resisting. They had all belonged here once. Now they belonged somewhere else. Maggie turned away from the photograph and moved slowly through the room. Her hand brushed lightly against the back of a chair, then the edge of a table, as if confirming that everything was still where it should be. After Daniel passed, the house didn't feel empty right away. It took time. At first, it was just quieter. Then the quiet became something that stayed, even when it wasn't wanted. The doctor had called it a peaceful passing. Maggie had never corrected him, but she had never agreed either. There was nothing peaceful about watching someone who had always been steady become still. After that, she learned the things she hadn't needed to know before. Bills, repairs, small sounds that meant something needed attention. The heater had been the first. It made a knocking sound one night, sharp and uneven. She had stood in the basement with a flashlight, tracing pipes she didn't fully understand until she found the source. It took her nearly an hour, but she fixed it. That mattered. Her Social Security check came on the third Wednesday of every month. She didn't need to open the envelope to know the amount. It was enough, if she was careful. And she was always careful. She stopped buying things she didn't need. Learned which repairs could wait and which couldn't. Turned the heat down at night. Wore layers indoors instead of reaching for the thermostat. The savings she and Daniel had set aside remained mostly untouched. Not because there was a lot, but because it meant something. Some days passed quietly. Too quietly. There were mornings when sunlight filled the kitchen in a way that almost felt like before. And there were afternoons when the silence pressed in from every corner, when even the ticking clock felt like it was marking something she could not quite name. On one of those afternoons, Evelyn Henson had knocked on her door. Evelyn was a narrow woman with sharp features and short white hair that never seemed out of place. She moved with a slight stoop, but carried herself with a kind of unapologetic steadiness. She had lived in Cedar Ridge longer than most people still there, and had outlasted more than one version of her own life. "You're keeping to yourself too much," Evelyn said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I've always kept to myself," Maggie replied. Evelyn gave a short, knowing look. There's a difference between keeping to yourself and disappearing. She stayed for tea anyway. They talked about ordinary things, prices at the grocery store, the new family down the street, the weather, which never seemed to settle anymore. Before she left, Evelyn paused by the door and placed a hand lightly on Maggie's arm. "Just don't forget you're still here," she said. Maggie had stood there for a long time after the door closed. That night she found herself back in the kitchen, looking at the brochures again. Safe, comfortable, managed. They were not wrong, but they were not quite right either. Maggie rested her hand on the stack, then slowly pulled it back. She turned instead toward the hallway, past the photographs, past the years that had settled into these walls. There was something else, something older, something she had not allowed herself to return to, not because it was gone, but because it had never been finished. And for the first time in years, Maggie let the thought come fully into focus. A house that was never completed. A promise that was never lived. Not forgotten. Just waiting. Sleep did not come easily that night. It circled around her, lingered just beyond reach, but never settled. Maggie lay still beneath the quilt, her eyes open, listening. The house spoke in small ways, the soft ticking of the clock, the distant hum of the heater, the faint shift of wood adjusting to the cold. These were familiar sounds, but tonight, they felt closer. She turned toward the window. A thin line of moonlight slipped through the curtain, pale and quiet. It rested on the floor, unmoving. Something about it felt unfinished. She didn't think the word at first. She felt it. Then, slowly, the memory followed. A piece of land. Not large, not remarkable, but theirs. Maggie closed her eyes, and this time, she didn't pull away. The first time they stood there, Daniel had been unusually quiet. He walked the length of the clearing without speaking, his boots pressing into the soft earth, his gaze moving not across what was there, but across what might be. "It's not much," he said eventually. "It doesn't have to be," Maggie answered. That had always been enough for them. The land sat just outside a small Pennsylvania town, far enough away that the noise of everyday life softened into something distant. Trees bordered the edges, tall and uneven, their branches shifting with the wind in a slow, unhurried rhythm. In the center, there was a patch of open ground where sunlight settled gently, as if it had nowhere else it needed to be. Daniel saw it immediately, not as it was, but as something waiting. He didn't rush into building. He never did. Instead, he spent time understanding the place, walking its edges, watching how the light changed through the day, noticing where the ground held firm and where it gave slightly under pressure. Maggie remembered the way he stood sometimes, hands resting at his hips, head tilted just enough to suggest he was listening. Not to sound, but to something quieter. When he finally began, it started small, a foundation that barely seemed enough to matter. "It's enough," he said, and she believed him. The frame rose slowly, boards fitted together with care, each piece measured twice, sometimes 3 times. He worked alone most days, though Maggie stayed nearby, handing him tools, brushing sawdust away, learning the rhythm of his work without needing instruction. They spoke less during those hours, not because they had nothing to say, but because everything that mattered seemed already understood. It was meant to be their last home, not in an ending sense, but in a peaceful one. They talked about it in fragments, morning coffee on a narrow porch, evenings where the only sound was wind through the trees, days that did not require rushing, a life that asked less of them, and gave something quieter in return. Maggie could see it clearly now, the unfinished walls, the scent of fresh wood, the light filtering through spaces where windows would one day be placed. But that day never came. The illness arrived, the way many things did at that stage of life, quietly at first, then all at once. Daniel dismissed it in the beginning. A cough, a kind of tiredness that didn't feel like anything serious. "It's nothing," he said. It wasn't. The diagnosis came quickly after that. Too quickly. Dr. Harris explained it with careful distance, his voice even, his words measured. He was a tall man with thinning hair and tired eyes, the kind that had delivered news like this too many times to let it reach him fully. Daniel listened. That was what Maggie remembered most. He didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't ask questions he already knew the answers to. He simply listened. The work on the house stopped soon after. Not by choice, by necessity. For a while, Maggie believed they would return. That this was only a pause. That the structure standing in that clearing would wait for them, unchanged. But time moved differently after that. Slower in moments, faster in others. And then it ended. The word still felt too small for what it held. The house remained exactly as it had been left. Frame complete, Walls standing. A roof that held, but not enough. No insulation. No warmth. No life. Maggie never went back. At first, there were reasons. Practical ones. Papers to sign. Calls to make. Details that filled the space where grief might otherwise settle. Later, the reason changed. She stayed away because she remembered too clearly. Because going back would mean standing inside something that should have been finished. And wasn't. She sat up slowly in bed. The room around her felt complete, everything in its place, everything known. But the memory of that other place remained different. Open. Unresolved. She swung her feet onto the floor, the cold grounding her more than the quiet ever could. For years, she had told herself that some things were better left as they were. Unfinished. Untouched. But standing there now, she realized something she had not allowed herself to consider. Not everything unfinished is meant to stay that way. Some things wait. Maggie walked toward the window and rested her hand against the glass. Outside, the street remained still, unchanged. Inside, something had shifted. This wasn't about leaving, and it wasn't about escaping. It was about returning to something that had been hers, to something that still was. And for the first time in years, the thought did not feel like something to avoid. It felt like something to follow. Morning arrived quietly, the way it always did in Cedar Ridge, without asking anything from anyone. Maggie stood at the kitchen counter, holding a cup of coffee she actually drank this time. The warmth settled slowly into her hands, steady and real. The room looked exactly the same, but she did not. She did not mention the conversation with her children again. There was nothing left to discuss. The brochures remained where she had placed them, untouched, their bright surfaces catching light that no longer belonged to her. She glanced at them once, then let her gaze move past. They were no longer part of the decision. Instead, she opened the lower drawer beneath the counter and reached toward the back, where older things were kept. Papers. Envelopes. A small box she had not opened in years. She brought it to the table and sat down slowly. Inside were documents from another time. Folded receipts, handwritten notes, and the deed she had not allowed herself to look at for years. The paper had aged. Edges softened, but the names remained clear. Daniel Lawson. Margaret Lawson. Together. Her fingers rested on the page for a moment before she flattened it carefully against the table. For a long time, she had treated that land as something finished. Now she understood it wasn't. She reached for the phone. The number was still written in the same address book, tucked between names she rarely called anymore. She hesitated only long enough to recognize the feeling. Then she dialed. "Law offices of Harold Bennett," came the voice on the other end. Older now, slower, but still steady. "Mr. Bennett," Maggie said, "this is Margaret Lawson." There was a pause, then recognition. "Well, I didn't expect to hear that name again," he replied, softer now. "It's been a long time." Harold Bennett had always been a man who looked like he belonged behind a desk. Tall, but slightly bent at the shoulders, as if years of leaning over documents had reshaped him. His hair had thinned into a careful gray, combed neatly to one side. His voice carried patience, the kind that comes from handling matters that could not be rushed, only understood. He had known Daniel well. not just as a client, as a man. "I need to confirm something," Maggie said. "About the property in Pennsylvania." "Of course," he replied. They spoke slowly, carefully. Nothing rushed. Harold explained what Maggie had already begun to understand, that the land was entirely hers now, that no one else had any legal claim unless she chose to give it, that her decisions were her own. "You're of sound mind," he added gently. "That's all that matters." Maggie nodded, even though he could not see her. When the call ended, the silence in the room felt different. Not empty, clear. She placed the documents back into the box, but did not return it to the drawer. This time, she left it where she could see it. The next days passed without announcement. Maggie did not rush. She prepared. At the grocery store, she moved the same way she always had. Slow, deliberate, unremarkable. But her choices had changed. Canned goods, dry food, items that would last without effort. She placed only a few in her cart each time, enough to look ordinary, never enough to be noticed. At the pharmacy, she refilled her prescriptions and asked a few quiet questions. The pharmacist, a young woman named Lena, answered politely, unaware that the questions carried more weight than they seemed. Back home, Maggie did not gather things in one place. She spread them out. A small bag in the hallway closet. Another near the bedroom. Nothing obvious. Nothing final. Her suitcase came down from the attic one afternoon, its edges worn, the zipper slightly stiff, but still working. She opened it on the bed and stood there for a moment before placing anything inside. Then she began. Not everything. Only what she needed. Warm clothing, practical shoes, a coat that had already lasted longer than most, each item folded carefully, each decision made without hesitation. The car required more thought. It had always been reliable, but Maggie understood distance differently now. She drove it to the edge of town, to a small garage that had been there longer than most of the houses around it. Tom Alvarez owned the place. He was a broad man with thick arms and a face shaped by years of work and weather. His dark hair had faded unevenly into gray, and his beard, short, rough, gave him a permanent look of quiet focus. He spoke little, but when he did, it was always direct. "You heading somewhere?" he asked, glancing at the car. "Just want to make sure it's ready," Maggie replied. He nodded once and began his inspection. Maggie waited on a wooden bench, the smell of oil and metal settling into the air. The sounds were steady, predictable, honest. When Tom returned, he wiped his hands on a cloth and looked at her. "It'll hold," he said. "Just don't rush it." Maggie gave a small nod. "I won't." He studied her for a moment, as if considering something else. Then he said nothing. That was something she appreciated. By the end of the second week, everything was ready. Not perfectly, but enough. That evening, Maggie moved through the house one last time, her hand brushing lightly across surfaces that had shaped most of her life. The kitchen, the hallway, the doorway where her children had once stood. She paused in the living room. Her eyes rested on Daniel. "I'll finish it," she said quietly. Not a promise. Something steadier. She turned off the light. That night, sleep came. Not because everything had been resolved, but because everything had begun. She left before the sky had fully decided on morning, at that quiet hour when the world still felt undecided. The air was cold enough to settle into her bones, but not harsh. Maggie closed the front door behind her with a steady hand. not lingering, not looking back. The bag rested in the back seat, the engine turning over with a familiar, slightly worn sound. She listened for a moment. Then she drove. The town passed her slowly, the houses dim and still, windows dark, lives paused in sleep. She had known these streets for most of her life. Every turn, every corner, every place that had once meant something. Now, they simply ended. The road opened wider as she moved beyond Cedar Ridge. The rhythm of the drive settled in quietly, mile after mile, passing without urgency. Trees lined the edges, bare branches stretching upward, the sky gradually softening into a pale gray blue. She did not rush. She remembered what Tom had said, and for once, she followed it. Hours passed in a quiet awareness that felt different from the silence she had known before. This was not emptiness. It was space. When the sound came, she recognized it immediately, a low vibration beneath her feet. Subtle at first, then sharper. Maggie eased her foot off the accelerator, her hands steady on the wheel. The engine responded unevenly, the sound growing louder before settling into a strained rhythm. Then, it stopped. She guided the car to the side of the road, gravel crunching beneath the tires as the engine gave one final hollow attempt before going still. The quiet that followed stretched outward. Not familiar, not controlled. Just open. Maggie stepped out, the cold air sharper here, less protected by the closeness of town. The road ran empty in both directions, bordered by trees and distance. She walked around the car slowly, her hand resting briefly against the hood. Warm, but silent. "Well," she said quietly, more to the moment than anything else. "That's far enough." The sound of a vehicle approached not long after, steady, unhurried. A pickup truck appeared in the distance, older but well kept, moving with the kind of consistency that suggested care rather than speed. It slowed as it neared her, then stopped. The driver stepped out first. Thomas carried his height with a slight forward lean, the kind that comes from years of working with his hands rather than sitting behind a desk. His beard was full but neatly kept, streaked with gray, and his eyes held a directness that did not need explanation. He moved without hesitation, but not with urgency either. "You stuck?" he asked simply. Maggie gave a small nod. "Looks that way." Before anything more was said, the passenger door opened. Eleanor stepped out with a careful steadiness that matched his pace. She was thinner than Thomas, her frame shaped by time rather than weakness. Her white hair was loosely tied back, and her face held the kind of softness that came from years of noticing small things others missed. There was warmth in her presence, but it was quiet, not overwhelming. "Car trouble always finds the loneliest roads," she said gently. Maggie almost smiled at that. Thomas had already looked under the hood by then, his movements efficient, practiced. He didn't stay long. "It's not roadside work," he said, closing it again. Maggie nodded. "I figured." Thomas glanced at the road, then back at her. "You close to where you're going?" "Yes." He studied her just long enough to understand something unspoken. "We'll take you," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor was already moving toward the truck. Maggie didn't hesitate this time. "Thank you," she said. The ride was quiet, but not empty. The road curved through stretches of land that felt less shaped, less owned. Maggie gave directions in short sentences, her voice steady. When the structure came into view, she felt it before she saw it. Then, it was there. The house stood where it always had, but time had not waited kindly. The wood had darkened, edges softened, parts of it leaning just slightly out of place. The roof held, though not convincingly. The windows were clouded, their frames worn. It had not changed. It had simply aged. "This it?" Thomas asked. Maggie nodded. They stepped out together. The ground shifted slightly beneath her feet, uneven, familiar in a way that reached further than memory. She stood still for a moment, taking it in, not with regret, not with shock, with recognition. Thomas moved first, testing the step before placing his weight on it. "It'll hold," he said. Inside, the air was colder than outside, carrying the scent of old wood and time left undisturbed. Light filtered unevenly through the openings, stretching across the unfinished floor. Eleanor walked slowly along the wall, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface. "It's still standing," she said quietly. "That matters," Thomas replied. They didn't ask her why she was there, and she didn't explain. Instead, Thomas stepped back outside and returned with a small bundle of firewood. Eleanor began clearing a space near one corner, moving debris aside with gentle efficiency. Maggie watched them for a moment, then stepped forward. The work came naturally. No instructions, no planning. Just hands moving where they were needed. The fire took time, the wood slow to respond, but eventually a small flame held, steady enough to push back the cold. Eleanor set a folded blanket down beside the wall. "You can rest here tonight," she said. Maggie nodded. "Thank you." Thomas stood near the doorway, looking out at the fading light. "We'll be back in the morning," he said. "Bring a few things." Again, not a question. A simple continuation. As the light outside dimmed, Maggie sat near the fire, her hands extended toward the warmth. The walls around her remained unfinished, the floor uneven, the air still cold. But something had shifted, not in the house, in the space between people. For the first time in years, the quiet around her did not feel empty. It felt shared. And somewhere within that quiet, something had already begun to return. Morning did not arrive quietly this time. It came with sound. Footsteps over gravel. The low hum of an engine cutting off. Voices. Soft, familiar. Already part of something before Maggie fully stepped outside to meet them. She paused at the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the frame. For a moment, she simply watched. Thomas stood near the truck, speaking with someone new, his posture the same as always. Steady, slightly forward, as if the ground itself leaned with him. Eleanor moved between them with quiet ease, already carrying something in her hands. This was not an interruption. It was a continuation. "Mornin'," Thomas said when he noticed her. Maggie nodded. "Morning." There were more people than the day before, not many. Just enough to make the space feel shared. Sarah was already at work, her sleeves rolled up, her movements quick but deliberate. Walter stood near the side of the house, studying the structure with the kind of quiet attention that came from years of understanding how things held together, and how they failed. Ben was unloading tools from the back of the truck, placing them down carefully, each movement precise, almost measured. No one asked what needed to be done. They already knew. The roof came first again, but this time it was not about holding. It was about reinforcing. Walter and Thomas worked side by side, their movements slow, tested, each step placed with care. The wood responded differently now, less resistant, as if it, too, had accepted the presence of hands again. Maggie found her place without needing to search for it. She carried. She steadied. She held boards in place while others secured them. Her movements were not as quick, not as strong, but they were sure. And that was enough. By midday, the sound of work had settled into a rhythm. Not loud, not rushed, just steady. At one point, Sarah stepped down beside her, brushing dust from her hands. "You've done this before," she said, not as a question. Maggie gave a small nod. "My husband," she replied. Sarah didn't ask more. She didn't need to. Instead, she handed Maggie a pair of gloves. "Then you already know where to stand," she said lightly. There was a kind of understanding in that. Simple, direct, unspoken. The afternoon passed in pieces. A window secured. A section of wall straightened. The doorway reinforced enough to open and close without catching. Inside, the space changed slowly. Not transformed, but claimed. Eleanor worked near the center of the room, organizing what had been cleared, setting things aside in a way that made the unfinished feel intentional. She moved with quiet patience, never rushing, never stopping, unless something needed to be done differently. At one point, she placed a small tin cup on a makeshift surface near the wall. "For water," she said. Maggie nodded. It was a small thing, but it stayed. Later, as the work slowed, Walter stepped back from the structure, his eyes moving across it with quiet assessment. "It'll hold through the season," he said. Not as a promise, as a fact. Thomas gave a short nod. "That's enough for now." No one argued. No one pushed further. They understood the rhythm of stopping as well as starting. That evening, they gathered again near the fire. It burned stronger now, the flames steady, the warmth reaching further into the space. Someone had brought fresh bread. Someone else, a small container of something warm that passed quietly between hands. There were no formal introductions. No need. They spoke the way people do when they are not trying to impress anyone. About weather, about work, about things that had happened long enough ago to feel distant but not forgotten. Maggie listened at first, then spoke. Not much. Just enough. And no one asked for more. Later, when the light had faded and the air cooled again, people began to leave in the same quiet way they had arrived. No goodbyes drawn out. Just small gestures. A nod. A hand raised. "We'll be back," Thomas said. Maggie nodded. "I know." When the last truck pulled away, the quiet returned. But it was no longer empty. Maggie stepped outside for a moment, the air settling gently around her. The land stretched out, open, unchanged, but she no longer felt separate from it. She turned back toward the house. The doorway stood straighter now. The roof held its line. Light from the fire flickered softly against the walls, touching places that had not held warmth in years. Inside, everything was still unfinished. But nothing felt abandoned. Over the next few days, the rhythm continued. Morning brought work. Afternoon brought rest. Evening brought quiet conversation. Small progress repeated itself until it began to feel like something larger. Maggie found a patch of ground near the side of the house where the soil softened under her hands. With Sarah beside her, she turned it slowly, breaking it apart, clearing what did not belong. They planted nothing yet, but the space was ready. And that mattered. There were still moments when the ache in her back reminded her of time, when her hands moved slower than she wanted them to. But the difference now was simple. She was not alone in it. Days passed, not quickly, not slowly, just steadily. And somewhere within that steady movement, something settled into place. The house was no longer waiting, and neither was she. The morning had already begun to move when Maggie noticed something different. Not in the rhythm, but beyond it. The sound came first. A car engine, unfamiliar, cutting through the quiet pattern she had grown used to. It didn't belong to the trucks that came and went, didn't carry the same steady pace. This one slowed, then stopped. Maggie turned before she realized she had. The car stood at the edge of the clearing, its surface still clean despite the road behind it. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then the driver's door opened. Dennis stepped out. He looked the same at first glance, but not entirely. His shoulders were tighter, his movements more controlled, as if he had carried something with him for longer than he intended. The lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened, not with age alone, but with pressure, decisions, responsibilities, things that did not leave easily. Behind him, Patricia stepped down carefully, her posture still composed, but her expression less certain than Maggie remembered. Her clothes were precise, unchanged by the surroundings. But here, that precision felt fragile, almost misplaced. Kevin followed last. He paused beside the car for a moment before closing the door, his gaze moving slowly, taking in the space piece by piece. There was something quieter about him now, not distant, but open in a way that had not been there before. They had found her. No one spoke. The distance between them held more than space. "Mama," Dennis said finally, his voice lower than usual. Maggie didn't move closer, but she didn't retreat either. "I'm here," she said. Patricia's eyes moved across the house, lingering longer than expected. The roof, the doorway, the window catching light. "This is where you've been?" she asked. There was no judgment in her tone, only disbelief. Maggie nodded. "Yes." Kevin said nothing. He was looking at the ground near the house, the turned soil, the faint outline of what would become something more. Sarah worked nearby, not stopping, not staring, simply continuing as if the moment did not require interruption. Dennis stepped forward, his gaze shifting between Maggie and the space around her. "We've been trying to reach you," he said. "You didn't answer." Maggie considered that, then nodded. "I know." The silence that followed was not empty. It was unsettled. Thomas approached from the side of the house, wiping his hands slowly, his expression unchanged. Eleanor followed, her presence quiet but grounding, her gaze moving between Maggie and the three figures before her. "These yours?" Thomas asked. Maggie nodded. "My children." Thomas gave a small nod and stepped back, understanding without needing explanation. Patricia looked toward Eleanor briefly, then back at Maggie. "You're staying here?" she asked. "Yes." The answer came easily, without defense. Dennis looked again at the house. This time he saw more. Not just the structure, but the effort within it. The repaired lines. The hands that had worked them. The people who had remained. Walter stood nearby, watching without intrusion. Ben adjusted something along the wall, focused, quiet. This wasn't abandonment. It wasn't neglect. It was life. "You're not alone," Kevin said. Maggie met his gaze. "No," she replied. For a moment, something in Dennis shifted. Small, but visible. The certainty he had carried before loosened, just slightly. Maggie stepped forward then. Not far, just enough. "I didn't leave because I was angry," she said. "And I didn't come here to prove anything." Her voice remained steady. "I came because this was something I never finished." She glanced briefly toward the house. "And I needed to." Patricia lowered her gaze for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly before relaxing again. Dennis exhaled. Slow. Kevin listened. Maggie reached into her coat and pulled out a folded envelope. She held it for a second before extending it toward them. "This is the deed to the house in town." Dennis hesitated before taking it. "What are you doing?" he asked. Maggie's eyes didn't waver. "You were right about one thing," she said. "It has value." Patricia inhaled softly. "If you need it," Maggie continued, "you can decide what to do." The words settled differently than expected. Not permission. Trust. Kevin stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You're giving it to us?" Maggie shook her head. "No," she said. "I'm trusting you with it." That was where it shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough. Patricia looked around again, this time more slowly. The house, the ground, the people, the quiet that held everything together. "This place," she said softly. "It's not what I thought." Dennis looked down at the envelope in his hand, then back at Maggie. "We thought you were alone." Maggie smiled faintly. "I was." Then she looked beyond them. "And then I wasn't." No one argued after that. No one insisted. The tension that had come with them did not disappear. But it softened, no longer needing to be held so tightly. For the first time in a long while, they stood together without trying to fix anything, without trying to decide. And slowly, they listened. 3 months changed the land in ways that could not be rushed. The path from the house to the garden had formed slowly, shaped by repetition rather than design. Each step Maggie had taken left something behind until the ground itself remembered where she belonged. The house stood differently now. Not finished, not restored to anything it once was, but lived in. That was the difference that mattered. Morning came with a quiet certainty she had not known before. Light moved through the window that had once been clouded, now catching on surfaces that carried signs of use instead of neglect. A cup placed where it would be reached again. A chair turned slightly toward warmth. Small things, but steady. Maggie stood near the counter, her hands moving through familiar motions as she prepared something simple. The knife was old, worn smooth by years of use, but it rested naturally in her grip. There was no hesitation anymore. Only rhythm. Outside, the garden held its first real promise. Rows that had once been nothing more than broken soil now showed small, deliberate growth. Leaves pressed upward, careful but persistent. The air carried the faint scent of earth that had been worked enough to begin giving something back. She stepped outside slowly, the cool air brushing against her face. Walter was already there. He stood near the fence line, his broad frame slightly bent as he checked the posts one by one. His hands moved with the same patience he had always carried, measured, certain, never wasting effort. "Fence'll need tightening before the cold sets in," he said without turning. Maggie nodded. There's time. Walter gave a small hum. There always is, if you start early enough. He didn't stay long. He never did. But his presence lingered in the work he left behind. By mid-morning, another sound came. This time, it was familiar. A car pulled into the clearing, slower than before, as if it already knew the shape of the land. Maggie didn't need to turn immediately. She recognized it. Dennis stepped out first. There was something different in him now. The tightness in his shoulders had eased, replaced by a steadiness that did not feel forced. He looked around before meeting her eyes, not searching, but noticing. Patricia followed, her posture still composed, but no longer rigid. The lines that once defined her movements had softened, as if she had allowed something to loosen without losing herself. Kevin stepped out last, holding the door open as a small boy climbed carefully to the ground. "Watch your step," Kevin said quietly. The boy nodded, concentrating on the uneven earth before looking up again. Behind them, another car arrived. Laura stepped out, her hair loosely tied, her expression open in a way that made space instead of closing it. She waved lightly before turning to help Emily out of the back seat. Emily paused beside the car, her eyes wide as she took in the space around her. The house, the garden, the quiet that felt different from the kind she knew. "This is where Grandma lives?" she asked. Maggie lowered herself slightly, meeting her gaze. "It is." Emily nodded slowly, as if placing that fact somewhere she would return to later. The day unfolded without instruction. Dennis found himself beside Walter before long, learning without being told how to hold, how to steady, how to follow the rhythm of work that did not demand perfection. Patricia moved through the house with a quieter awareness, noticing things she had not seen before. The cup Eleanor had left, the blanket folded against the wall, the way light entered and stayed. "You've changed it," she said. Maggie shook her head gently. "We all did." Outside, Kevin knelt beside Emily near the garden, guiding her small hands into the soil. "Not too hard," he said. "It's still growing." Emily looked at him, then back at the ground. "So it's not ready yet?" Kevin smiled. "It is, just not finished." Nearby, Sarah watched briefly before returning to her work, her expression carrying a quiet approval she did not need to voice. Food appeared as it always did now, without announcement, without need to ask who had brought it. Bread, something warm, something sweet passed from hand to hand. No one counted. No one needed to. As the afternoon softened, Maggie stood at the edge of the yard, watching without holding on to anything too tightly. Dennis stepped beside her. "We didn't sell it," he said. Maggie didn't look at him immediately. "I know," he nodded. "We go back sometimes. The house." She turned slightly. "With the kids," he added. "We clean it. Stay a while." Maggie's expression shifted. "That's good." Dennis looked down briefly, then back toward the house. "It doesn't feel like something to lose anymore," he said. Maggie let the words settle. They didn't need to be answered. Behind them, Patricia called to Laura, reminding her to gather something before it grew dark. Kevin laughed at something Emily said, the sound light, unforced. When the time came to leave, it happened slowly. No one rushed. Patricia hugged her, brief but certain. Dennis stayed a moment longer than before. Kevin nodded, his gaze steady. Emily waved. Bye, Grandma. Maggie raised her hand. I'll see you again. This time, it was not a hope. It was something she knew. When the cars disappeared, the quiet returned once more. But it no longer belonged to absence. It belonged to space. Maggie turned back toward the house, the garden, the path shaped by her own steps. The evening settled gently around her. Inside, there was warmth. Outside, there was growth. And between those two things, there was something she had not been able to name before. Now she could. Freedom was not the act of leaving. It was the act of choosing. And she had chosen. As the seasons continued to turn, Maggie's story settled into something quieter than a miracle, yet just as meaningful. Nothing in her life changed all at once. The house was still simple, the work still ongoing, the days still carrying their share of aches and small uncertainties. But what had changed was how she lived them. She was no longer waiting for life to happen. She was part of it again. In shared meals, steady hands that showed up without being asked, and a garden that grew because someone cared for it, there was a quiet kind of grace. Some may call it coincidence. Others may call it kindness. But there are moments that feel gently guided. When the right people arrive, when courage returns, when a new path opens. Perhaps that is how God works. Not always in grand miracles, but in small, faithful beginnings. If this story stayed with you, you might pause and think about what in your life is still waiting to be lived. If you feel like sharing, you can leave a comment or tell us where you're watching from. And if stories like this bring you comfort, you're always welcome to stay connected. May your days be filled with quiet strength, and may God's blessings find you in the moments you need them most.
Before you go, I want you to know that wherever you are in the world right now, I hope that something good might find a way to you today. And if my stories speak to you, I would like you to stay for a while. Feel free to leave a comment to let me know where you're watching from. And if you like to walk this path with me, please like and subscribe. Until next time, please take care of yourself